Who misses free and affordable ads and social networks without the anti-sex work rhetoric? Assembly 4 is a team of sex workers and technologists in Melbourne, Australia, aiming to bring back free and fair advertising and social spaces to the sex working community. They also give back to organizations based in harm reduction, sex work, and education. Stepping away from the clunky design of traditional platforms, their two products, Tryst.link and Switter.at, are refreshing and well-needed changes in both presentation and mission. Both are free to join and open to all. In the words of an A4 user, from the policies to the language to the advice and tips, it makes such a big difference to feel encouraged and supported instead of policed. Check out their website, assembly4.com, for the word and not the number, for more info. Welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
News and stories from the sex industry.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Welcome back to another episode of the Peep Show podcast. This week I talked to Tracy Clark-Flory about her new book, Want Me, a sex writer's journey into the heart of desire. Is there enough kink and flirtation in your life right now? Aorta Films creates lusty, opulent, glorious fuckery. Their films are full of beautifully shot, super hot queer porn featuring a large range of bodies, identities, kinks, and dynamics. This month, check out Aorta's newest release, Hard at Work, featuring Indigo and Zay Royale. Working from home has its perks, so when Zay Royale finds Indigo working overtime, they decide to take matters, and Indigo's dick, into their own hands. Shot during the pandemic, this at-home short featuring IRL partners buzzes with electric, intimate energy. $9 a month on Patreon gets you full access to Aorta's library of 60-plus short and featured films, with a new film released on the first of each month. Or back them at the $17 a month level and you get a download of that month's film delivered straight to your inbox.
Hey, I'm Adrian, one of the hosts of After Adult Podcast. My porn name should be Mozart Fremont, but you probably know me better by my actual porn name, Siri.
I'm Rachel, but my porn name would be Woody 16th Avenue.
After Adult is a podcast about life and porn.
I don't actually watch porn.
I don't really watch that much porn either. I probably watch more than you, but I mean, most of the time it kind of would feel like going to work on my day off.
You 100% watch more than me, because I don't watch porn. Find us wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for After Adult.
Or visit afteradult.com and follow us on Instagram at afteradult.
I'm here today with Tracy Clark-Flory, who's a senior staff writer at Jezebel. Her work has been published in Cosmopolitan, Elle, Esquire, Marie Claire, The Guardian, Women's Health, and the yearly Best Sex Writing Anthology. Prior to Jezebel, she was the senior staff writer at Salon, where she covered the sex beat for years. She lives in the Bay Area with her family. So welcome, Tracy.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. I just read your new book, Want Me, a sex writer's journey into the heart of desire, and I liked it so much.
Oh, thank you.
Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about the book?
Yeah, sure. I set out writing this book thinking that I was writing a book about straight men's desire and my sort of interaction with it as a journalist. And then I realized that really I was writing a book about my own desire, my own relationship to men's desire. And often like the way that my own desire was sort of routed through straight men. So it was this sort of like backwards approach to what the book actually ended up being, which is very much about sort of coming of age as a woman with this sort of aim of sexual empowerment, quote unquote, sexual empowerment. And this wish to sort of become what straight men want.
Yeah. That was so clear, like, especially in the first half of your book, that like you were trying really hard to find your own sexuality, but what you were really doing was just like mimicking what you thought straight men were into.
Right. And which I don't think was like always true, right? Which is,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunate, right? Like I was sort of like playing to this idea, this even fantasy, I would say, of what straight men want from women.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
in that sense, I think like both parties were often sort of losing out.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. I've thought so much about this. It's really interesting reading your book because I've also written a sex column and I do a lot of writing about the sex industry and I am a content creator. So like I think occupy a lot of the same spaces as you, but I realized that I came at all of this from like a totally opposite position, which was so interesting to read what you were writing because I got married when I was 20 to my high school boyfriend, and we were married for almost 20 years before we split up. And I never consumed porn until like I actually got into the porn industry. And so
Mm.
like my whole like sexual journey started off like I didn't have access to any of that.
Mm.
I actually didn't have like an idea in my head of what like sexuality was supposed to be like.
Oh,
And
interesting.
I was thinking like that reading your writing was so interesting because I was like, this isn't really a perspective that like I don't want to say it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but that wasn't my like experience. And
Right.
so when I came into like dating and having relationships with other people and working in the sex industry, I was like so set in my own sexuality.
Well, that's amazing. I mean, I was going to ask you, like, do you think that that was a good thing to sort of have that space to develop your own sense of sexuality? Because to me, that sounds ideal. Right?
Yeah, you know what? I never thought of it as a bad thing. Like I think it's kind of an odd thing like in our culture today, but I never thought of it as a bad thing. I think it was really, I don't know, like PJ, my husband now, like he jokes that like I'm the least sexually inhibited person he's like met. And
Hmm.
I think maybe that's because I don't have like a lot of, I don't know, I don't have a lot of ideas about like how things are supposed to
Right.
be,
Right.
and
And
so
that's
it's
like,
like
yeah.
you would think it would make me more rigid, but it actually is like makes me a little more fluid. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I think that makes total sense because I think that's just such a huge hurdle is to get over this sort of sense of expectation and how things should be.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which is, I mean, it's awesome that you are a sex columnist who, you're coming from a place of sort of having some sort of wisdom to pass along to people around that, lack of sort of an ideal or supposed to around sex.
Mm-hmm. It was so interesting. There were places where you were writing like advice to people, and you realize that you're writing advice to yourself because
Yes.
these are also problems that you, like you were in the
Right.
middle of dealing with, and that's so interesting. It's so interesting that like your career path followed along your own like path of personal empowerment or your own sexual journey.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I mean, so often, yeah, that was the case. Like, whether it was in my sort of journalistic pursuits or in writing an advice column, like it was so often the case that I was sort of, I was getting this education that I really needed around
Mm-hmm.
all
Mm-hmm.
aspects of sex. But yeah, there was a long period where, like, when I was writing an advice column for Salon, where I felt like very much the sort of imposter, or like Dan Savage was calling on me to offer reader advice,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
to a woman who was faking orgasms, and like there
Yeah.
I was faking orgasms in my own life, right? So
Yeah, yeah. That whole scene was really funny. Yeah, because you're like trying to figure out how to do that on your own. And I think actually sometimes teaching is the best form of education too.
mm,
Like pushes you to consider things, to kind of like reflect on
totally.
your own experiences.
Well, and I think that, like, of course, it's always easier to give good advice to other people. And so I think,
Mhm.
there's this way, especially like in sort of advising this woman who was writing in about her orgasm, like, I was able to give her advice that I then in turn took for myself, and that worked out really well. But, and of course I could have just given that advice to myself before she wrote the letter, but somehow there is this way in which it's easier to kind of see it when you're, addressing someone else.
I don't know if you've read this essay, but Lorelei Lee's essay, Once You've Done Pornography, she writes that so powerfully about feeling standing up for other sex workers and the negative way people are treating them made her realize that people shouldn't treat her that way either.
Yes.
But she had to see it in somebody else and be like, wait, that's fucked up. She doesn't deserve that. And then and then turn it back on yourself and be like, wait, but I don't either.
Yeah, that's not okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that there is something about this just being in relationship with other people, actually, whatever that looks like, whether you're writing advice or you're just standing up for your friends or you're seeing your own struggles reflected back to you through them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what was the process of writing the book like for you?
Oh, man. I mean, I started working on the proposal when I was, I must have been 8 months pregnant, and I was laid off from my job at a media startup because there was a pivot to video. That was when that was happening across the media landscape. And so I was kind of confronting the reality that my, maternity leave was not going to really be a real maternity leave from the job. And also the fact that who wanted to hire this very pregnant woman who was going to have to go on maternity leave. And so it just was the sort of opportunity it felt like to write this book that I'd wanted to write for a very long time, in various forms over the years. And so it just was kind of the right moment to begin exploring it. And so that was really, that was the backdrop, this major shift in my life, which was becoming a mother. That was the backdrop of beginning to sort of reflect back on the journey up to that point.
I like that about the book because it encompasses so many different stages of your life. Starting off as a very young writer who's having kind of unsatisfying sex with different people as you're going along to falling in love and getting married and having a kid and then grappling with, well, what does that mean?
Right.
What does that mean for me? What does that mean for me as a writer, as a person, as a sexual being?
Right. Well, I think the motherhood shift is so big, right? It's, I think, it's one of the biggest ones for me was stepping out of my 20s and into my 30s and becoming a mom and trying to reckon with what does it mean to be a sexual being and to be a mother, because those things are so often held in contradiction, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In ways that are a bit stifling for women.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing is I it was kind of this I think in the book, it's this final challenge in that I've gone on this whole sort of journey around sex and sexuality and sort of discovering myself. And then, motherhood felt like this thing where I'd gone through that whole process and started to really accept and come to terms with my own desires. And then motherhood felt like this, very sort of censoring, in that it felt like, oh, those things are off limits to me now because I'm pregnant, or those things are off limits to me now because I'm a mom. And there are all these sort of expectations that come along with motherhood that preclude that sort of sexual expression, which of course isn't true.
Right.
I don't actually believe, but there was I had that sort of knee-jerk reaction to it where I had to kind of go through that sort of acceptance journey again, specifically around being a mom and how do I incorporate all parts of myself?
Yeah. I think, and that it was really interesting to me the way that you talked about being pregnant. And part of the thing that I thought was interesting was that you felt like you even had to censor your thoughts.
Right, which is absurd, right? But
yeah, you can't think too naughty thoughts because you have a baby inside of you that's going to somehow pick up on those or something.
Right. Yeah, which and I included that because it It is just, it's so silly, the idea that you're not even allowed to think about these things. But of course, a lot of people have those feelings, whether they're pregnant or not, around desires like that.
Yeah.
Even the desire, not even the action, just feels off limits and taboo. And I think there's a lot to be said for sort of confronting the prohibitions on our sexual fantasies, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. So last week on the podcast, I had Juniper Fitzgerald, who
Yeah.
was working she talked about this on the podcast, that she was working at a brothel when she got pregnant. And the brothel owner told her, like, you can no longer work here because I would feel irresponsible because anyone who would want to book you must be like a pedophile or something. And she was like, what? Like, what are you talking about? But it was something that was interesting. And I think like along the same lines of what you were saying, and that there's this like very strong message in our culture that like the body of a pregnant woman like no longer really belongs to her. It's at the service of the baby. And so you're even like thinking, oh, well, I have to make sure I don't think bad thoughts because the baby.
I can't infect this baby with my dirty thoughts. Right. Well, it is like, I write in the book about how, becoming pregnant, there are all these sort of prohibitions on like what you're supposed to do with your body that include just like, whether you can drink alcohol, like if there's even the possibility that you might possibly become pregnant, so suddenly, like as soon as a fetus is involved, right? Like there are all these prohibitions on what a pregnant person is supposed to do. And so,
right. And those are like very strictly enforced by people around you, monitoring what, that judgment. I felt when I was pregnant, like very judged, not for, I can't even really think of like anything in particular, but there's something that like, there's this kind of feeling that you have that people are watching what you're doing to see if you're going to be like a good mom or something.
Right. Yeah. Your body is not your own anymore. And obviously like the battle over reproductive rights plays that out very dramatically as well. So I mean, I felt that intensely.
Yeah. Yeah. And you even like talk about going on to like a porn set, being pregnant and feeling like conflicted feels about that.
Yeah. I mean, and the conflicted feelings was just entirely the sense of like how I would be judged as a mother. Right. And that is a reality.
Right. Yeah. How have you like worked through that? Like what have been the biggest changes in like your own relationship to yourself or to your sexuality, like having gone through that process of becoming a mom?
I mean, I think the thing in the end about going through pregnancy and becoming a mom was that it actually ultimately put me more deeply in my body. I think because it sort of freed me up from a lot of the sort of expectations that I'd been sort of struggling with beforehand when I was in my 20s. I think I had this sense of sort of being freed by becoming irrelevant. Like that there's this.
I hear older women say that, like when they stop getting noticed, like post-menopause, they have the same sort of feeling of like being freed of something, being freed of the gaze or something.
Yeah, no, I think it was something similar for me where I just felt like, I was like, oh, I'm a mom, that I could be so easily dismissed as that. And of course, like there's the idea of a MILF, but like to me, the idea of a MILF is like the very idea of it is that it's exceptional, like that a mother would be fuckable. It's like something of note.
When I was in grad school, I had somebody come up to me and I remember being really mad about it because he told me they were like doing this like thing that people should never do, but if they do, should have stopped doing by high school, where they're like talking about ranking how hot, the women were. And then he said to me, oh, well, you're a mom, so you should feel lucky because you have affirmative action, like of hotness, because you don't have to be as hot as like the non-moms in order to be considered hot, because the like bar is lower.
Right. Exactly.
And I was like,
Exactly.
what the fuck?
Yes. I mean, that's the exact mentality behind MILF, I think, right?
Yeah. But to have somebody so clearly articulate that, I was like, oh my God, what?
Wow. Yeah. The nerve. Amazing.
Yeah. Meanwhile, he's like not an attractive guy at all.
Of course not. Yeah. Of course not. Not surprising at all that he's still had the nerve to say that. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
No, but I do think that there's something, for me, there was something very freeing about it. And also I think there's this weird way in which, like, you know, going through labor and kind of experiencing where my body could go, what it could do, what it could survive, like really put me in my body physically in a way where, I don't know, I just was so much more in touch with it after giving birth, where I was so much more in awe of it. And it was like, I was in awe of what it could do in a way that was not related to men. Like it was not related to what it could sort of provide for straight men, but what it could provide for myself, that it could provide a baby that I love, you know, that. And so that was such a shift in relationship to my own body that was honestly profound.
Yeah.
And so I think that was like a really interesting sort of shift for me, where, I mean, honestly, like talking about moms not being considered sexy, like I've never felt sexier in my entire life than after giving birth. And that was like partly what I was just speaking to, but also probably like the hormones that were, you know, roiling in my body and all of that. And I think like moments like that where I think you confront how, you confront the lie of what we're told about sex, right? Like, because we're like, that's not supposed to be when you're feeling sexiest, right?
Right.
And yet here I was feeling the sexiest I'd ever been when I was, you know, quote unquote irrelevant and sort of over the hill as a mom. Like, and so there's something freeing, I think, in coming up against those lies, sort of getting to the other side of them.
Yeah, I also think like when I hear you talk about that, what I'm thinking is suddenly that it's not just that you're feeling so much sexier, but it's that like your notion of what it means to be sexy has shifted.
100%.
Like it's no longer about like somebody else's approval.
Exactly. It's right. I mean, that's like the fundamental shift. It's like the fundamental shift from I am sexy because someone else tells me I am to I feel sexy, and that is sexy. Like that is what sexiness is.
Yeah.
Which is not to sort of discount like the fact that like being desired, like that's a valid sort of pleasure to have and to experience. Right. But it's like when that is so much your exclusive relationship to pleasure and desire, you know, for me, at least, that felt pretty constricted and limited.
You don't talk about this as much like in your book, but to me, I feel like this is also a conversation about like aging, like the changing relationship that you have with your body when you age, and when you like come to know yourself on a deeper level. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what else to say about that, except that like, as you were talking, that's what I was thinking about is like, I'm almost 43. My body looked and felt much different when I was, 23 and more like conventionally hot by like our culture's standards.
Exactly.
But I didn't feel that in the same way.
No, not at all. I mean, that's the thing is that it's just like the disconnect or like the contradiction there is so incredible to sort of, to experience in your own life where you like, of course you can look back and I feel the same. Like I can look back at my 23-year-old self, like who was, who met that ideal in certain ways, right?
Yeah,
especially around being youthful. And then, the reality of that young person's sexual experience, oh my God, relative, to what it is now, where I do not embody that, idealized body. God, I mean, and it's sort of sad that, so often you have to sort of go on that journey yourself to kind of get to the other side in order to really feel and believe and understand that. Like,
Yeah.
of course, I had encountered messages to that effect, especially from older women rather in my life. But honestly, like, I found it as a younger person hard to really believe, because it was in such contradiction with every other message that I received elsewhere.
You also don't have anything to attach it to if you've like never had that experience.
Right.
And you know, and when I say that like I had a different experience than you, I learned myself before I like measured that against a lot of other messages. That's true. But I also like didn't know my own like pleasure as much as I do now. I also like I don't know, you get older and you become more relaxed with your body and you become more comfortable in it. And you have different sorts of experiences that open you up in different ways. And if you haven't had that yet, like it's not, somebody can tell you that will happen and you won't really have a way to make sense of that.
Right. And there's so few like reference points, I think, for younger people who don't have those reference points from personal experience. Like there's so few reference points for what, like, for how sex can be pleasurable on that level. Like we have these really idealized notions of it, these very fantastical notions, but it's really hard to kind of like wrap your head around. Like I grew up like in Berkeley, California, and my parents were a couple of hippies and they had like very positive messages around sex. And I remember my dad describing sex as two star systems colliding in outer space. And, that sounds cool, but like, what does that mean?
Yeah, as a very young person, you're like, how do I get that? That's not exactly a roadmap to good sex.
Could you give me a few more specifics, please? Like, what is a star system even? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting too, though. So, you're talking about this sort of experience through childbirth and having a baby and feeling very powerful in that. But another thing that you're talking about throughout the book is like the death of your mother and how that kind of played into your kind of your sexual awakening. And I was thinking, you have actually, I'm going to look at this because this was so striking to me. You have this paragraph in here where it says, when you started to have like really satisfying and like connected sex, but it was also after the death of your mom. And you said no mainstream women's magazine editor wanted these hot sex tips: terminal illness, death, grief, existential terror. That was not a traffic bonanza of a listicle, but it was the truth. Good sex often had less to do with aesthetics or special moves than it did with feelings, those things that are harder to summon or sell. That was like so powerful to me because I do think, as a sex writer too, like I've worked with a lot of editors who are like, well, can you talk about, what the best position is to have this sort of experience? And that always seems very weird to me because I'm like, you're not going to have the best sex based on the position that you're in. Like, that's not what sex is about. Like that's a really strange way to come at it. To me. And I appreciated what you said, because if you can like actually hit like deep parts of yourself by going through these experiences, it's and trusting somebody else, it's like a very different sort of thing.
Right. And I mean, it's positions, like specific techniques are like the very least of it. Right. And and yet that is the primary focus of so much sex advice, unfortunately, because it is harder. It's much harder to talk about the ways in which like emotion can fuel sex and can fuel some of our most powerful sexual experiences, right? And then we also have these ideas of like what it's sort of acceptable, to incorporate into a sexual experience or into pleasure, like the idea of having really great sex in the midst of grief over your mother's death, like it's very, unacceptable, right? Like, and yet
Right.
that's the truth. And it's like, I think, it's maybe it's hard to talk about or it's hard to hear. But it's the truth that like, and I think that's like, that's one of the amazing things about sex is that like sex meets us at all of these various points in our lives. Right. And that the sex that we have can change over the course of a lifetime, like based off of, what we're going through. And like that, like that's part of what we should be celebrating is the sort of richness and variability of that experience, which is like, it's so far from the sort of tips and tricks realm.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting. I mean, I was thinking as you were saying, it is a very far cry from the tips and tricks. But also like, it's not something that you could it's not advice that you can give. And I think that that's why, that doesn't sell and why people aren't looking for 1,000-word articles on that because it's not, as easy to translate. It's kind of like the ineffable parts of sex. But I think that, as you were talking, I think you're right. Our like desires do like shift throughout our lifetime, depending on what we're going through. And that's, one of the things that I thought was really lovely about your book too, is because you talked about the periods in your life where you were really kind of emotionally distraught, that you were seeking out, rougher sex, and then the times that you were looking for more like healing experiences. And the fact that that's one of like the really powerful things about sex, I think, is that it can meet you at all of those places.
Right. I mean, and that's like, I think to me, like, I think I write a lot in the book about porn. And like one of the really valuable things that I think I got from porn, as much as it is sort of, popularly critiqued in terms of like misleading people about what, good sex looks like really one of the things that I got from porn early on was like that it kind of, awakened me to the realm of fantasy. And I sort of was able to explore like, kind of where my mind could go and, all these surprising sort of places, that I think, that totally relates in that it's just like the ways in which, sex and sexual fantasy can be this sort of playground or like this realm of play and make believe that whether it's like in your own mind or whether it's with a partner, that there's such possibility to sort of engage with it, like based off of wherever you are in your life in that moment.
Yeah. And engage with it when it's too difficult to access like other emotions.
Yes. Right.
You can engage with those emotions in this like kind of roundabout way that I think can be really helpful to experiencing those.
And that you can do it with another person in this way that like there are so few things, like so few sort of opportunities that we get to sort of like be with another human being in those sorts of feelings, like in that sort of exploration. Like it's like this sort of it's just this realm of make-believe that we get to enter into with another person and to sort of have companionship in that. It so stands apart, I think, from the rest of our sort of adult lives, right?
Right. And as adults, there is like very few places that we can play.
Right. And let go and be someone other than we are, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as like, so I'm a phone sex operator primarily, and that's one of the reasons that I love doing that work is that like, because it is, especially since it's a form of sex in which like bodies are taken out and it's only an imaginative space. I mean, bodies are also part of it, and mutual masturbation is part of it, and pictures are part of it. But like, it is really an imaginative space, and I think that being able to like share that with people and get into their like fantasy lives and open up space for that and be like, okay, so you're not usually supposed to talk about this thing, but like here we can.
Yeah. Well, and how powerful is that, right? For someone to sort of have a sort of safe space that's held for them to be with another person in that.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And that's so much different than like sitting there and having a fantasy on your own, because somebody else like contributes to that and pushes it further. And like it's, a give and take in the way that play is a give and take.
Right. Well, and I think too, like, I think so much of sort of sharing a fantasy with someone, there's, part of the sort of satisfaction of it is that you can expose this secret, hidden, perhaps taboo part of yourself and experience what it's like to then not have that other person run away, or like point their finger at you and laugh. And like that, I think, can be really meaningful for people.
Yeah.
Hello, this is Chelsea Poe from TroubledFilms.com. I'm here to tell you about getting access to hot BDSM, queer, trans, and dyke porn all in one place. With code PEEPSHOW21, you can get 21% off your next order from TroubledFilms.com. Again, that's code PEEPSHOW21, TroubledFilms.com.
It's interesting. I can't remember who I was talking to, but in relation to what you were saying about porn, one of the things that somebody I interviewed at some point was saying is that porn for them, like what was so powerful about it was seeing some of the fantasies that they had that they felt somewhat like embarrassed about or ashamed about put out for them and being able to be like, oh, look, there's other people who like that. And then feeling less alone in their desires. There's something like very social about that.
Well, I think that's so interesting because, I think like we often think about porn as something that just like happens, it's like a solitary activity, right? But there is a social aspect to it in that like when you go on a porn website or a tube site, like you're experiencing that you are part of a community of people who are engaging with this material, who are seeking this material out. Like this material is being targeted to you in this way that like suggests that you're not alone. And like, and especially even like the tube site model, you can see like how many people have viewed this same video, like how many people have given it a thumbs up, like that. I think, it is, I think there is that aspect to it of, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one.
Yeah. Yeah. And kind of getting validation through that.
Well, and I think like one thing that sort of really drove that home for me was like the first time that I visited the AVN Expo, like to see, mostly men, but to see these porn fans sort of like in community, like standing like with each other, sometimes interacting with each other, like, it's something different to sort of see that like in the physical world and to, to see that it it isn't really a solitary activity in the end.
Yeah. And that's what's been really interesting to me too about, creating porn and having fan sites and stuff is that, and I started in this as a cammer. So like being, doing cam too, is that you do see that like suddenly, people are fans are interacting with each other about you and they're building some sort of like little community with each other, and that's so, and, talking off one another. And that's really, really interesting, I think. And because I did less camming than a lot of people, I've heard other, I talked to a really established veteran cam model who one time said that one of her cam room people, his wife died, and the cam room, all of the fans in there pitched in and like had flowers sent to his house and stuff. So these are like other porn fans that were like supporting each other. And there's something so lovely about that.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Like there are so many different types of sexual community, right? And it is interesting how like porn viewers are not usually talked about in that way at
Yeah.
all. Yeah.
So I have a confession to make that's kind of funny. So I was reading your book and I follow your, articles, especially the ones on the sex industry, but I didn't know much about your personal life. So I'm reading the book and I'm like, wait, did she get married? Is she going to marry one of these guys? I'm like reading it like it's a novel, and then and then I put in Tracy Clark-Flory, husband, and like I Google searched that. And then like 10 pages later, you said, one of the top searches for my name is Tracy Clark-Flory, husband. I was like, wow, how did I just do that? And I felt totally stupid. I was
really
like,
amazing.
I can't wait to find out if she got married or not. I got to Google this.
Oh my God. You went for the spoiler. I love it.
I did. And then I felt stupid because you called it out.
That's so great.
Yeah, it was really funny. So yeah, but when I went down this like Tracy Clark-Flory husband rabbit hole, I saw that there was which there is one, which is interesting.
That's so funny.
Yeah, I saw that there was people talking about, and you also like responding to this about people wanting to know about what your husband thinks about marrying somebody who has had this very open sex life. And I'm kind of curious like what writing the book was like, because that's a lot more about, your own your personal relationship and your marriage. What was that like for him and for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, it's I've shared the book with my husband, Christopher, and I was a little nervous because I tried to put myself in his shoes and imagine that he had written a memoir that, describes in great detail some of his, sexual interactions with women before me. Like, that makes me uncomfortable to think about, right? And so I think he too was a little bit, he was a little nervous going into it. And was unsure. I mean, there was nothing in the book that was news to him, but like, it's different from knowing the sort of broad strokes of someone's past experience. And then it's another thing to read about it in great detail. And so I was very nervous about it. And then he read it, and I was just like really pleasantly surprised to be able to like sit on the couch next to him and like watch as he was like, laughing out loud at certain points, or like, reading lines out loud. And there were chapters that he, struggled with, mostly because I had been going through such a difficult time, at that part in the book. And so it was difficult for him to read for that reason. But really in the end, he finished the book and he was okay. He survived. It was fine. He enjoyed it in the end.
Yeah.
And I think what's been really nice is that, it's really felt like, honestly, it's brought us closer, because it, in a way it's like of course I'm sharing this book with anyone who wants to read it, but to share it with him and to experience that sort of acceptance from my own partner, who's able to kind of transcend, the sort of natural jealousy instinct, and really be able to kind of feel compassion for, my younger self, and everything that she was experiencing has been a really nice experience. Honestly, it's like been a really nice aspect of the book, coming out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I also think it's interesting, like in light of your mom's reaction to your writing, which is that she didn't feel like she could be like as brave as you. That's like kind of came out several times in the book.
Yeah. Like she felt punished for her sexuality growing up, and she was very nervous for me. Like when I, in my 20s, started writing about sex on the internet, like she was very concerned for me. And I think rightfully so, because she was seeing what the trolls, the commenters were saying about me. And, and I think, it's interesting. I think Christopher doesn't, he doesn't so much have that. I don't think. And I also think that like my experience of writing online has shifted. Like I think in the sort of mid 2000s, this sort of unmoderated, comments realm was really bad. It was really bad and it was scary. And I think that, things have marginally improved where it doesn't feel quite like I'm subject to quite as much harassment.
Yeah, that's nice to hear.
Yeah.
Yes, I can understand that. Like, I can understand why she would be concerned about how you're gonna weather that sort of like judgment.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think like, those sort of generational shifts can be so big where, I think, she got pregnant when she was 18. And she was sort of, from my perspective, kind of coerced into, giving the baby up for adoption. And that was something that really, and part of that was because of family shame. Right. And so she, had sort of felt marked with the scarlet letter for the rest of her life. That was something my dad had told me after she died. And so I think, she linked that very much to her sexuality, that sort of punishment. And so like for her, she definitely did not feel like she had that sort of freedom to sort of put herself out there in the way that, I felt that I could.
Right.
And so I think, generationally, like it was kind of hard for her to understand.
Yeah. I've had the same sort of like dynamic with my mom who has struggled with the way that I publicly talk about sex and I think I think you're right. I think that is a kind of common generational divide.
Right. Right. Yeah.
That we all have to like, anyone who works like anywhere in the, in the realm of sexuality has to somehow deal with their families, with their parents in particular.
Right.
Because like with my kids, it's been like super easy actually, like because they've grown up with me and it doesn't seem like a big deal to them. And they're like, it's, my job, it's what I do. And it doesn't seem particularly strange to them. But for like the generation above me, that's a whole different story.
Well, and it's so wonderful that for them, it's just part of their world, right? Like that's just so normal, probably almost boring. Like,
yeah.
Like, oh, mom.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because like my teenagers, like my son in September, I was still running my column then. He was like, Mom, do you know what No September is? And I was like, yes. And he's like, oh, you should write about that. And I was like, yeah, you know what? I should. That's a good idea.
Oh my God. I love that. I love that.
And I was like, how do you know what No September is?
That's amazing. Right. You're like, let's follow up with some questions. That's so funny. I love the idea of a kid as a source of story ideas.
Yeah. Or like sometimes he'll ask me to like explain something. And then I'm like, you know what? Other people would be curious about this too.
Right.
That's
but yeah. So great.
Yeah. So, what was your main, we can wrap this up, but what was your main takeaway either from writing the book or like, it must have been quite a journey to sit down and think about, kind of chronologically and emotionally how you got from where you were in your early 20s to where you are now.
Yeah. I mean, the main thing I think that I took away, the thing that was most valuable in the research that I did sort of around the book as I was thinking about these themes was this idea that like in the 90s, there emerged this sort of neoliberal notion of sexual empowerment. This, feminist notion of sexual empowerment that was very much focused on individual advancement that sort of abandoned the sort of aims of like collective struggle and collective gain. And I think that I was like very much infected by that sort of thinking, right? Like, and I think that's been a really useful frame for me to sort of think about like what, like my teens and 20s, like what that sort of the illusion of sexual empowerment that I was laboring under, which was just like, if I just, do it right, like sexual empowerment will be mine, as opposed to recognizing like all of the systemic things that I was struggling against. And so for me, like that's the major takeaway is that, individually, we can, of course, like struggle to sort of better understand ourselves and find greater pleasure, but that there are inherently limitations in that sort of approach to, quote unquote, sexual empowerment, and that like, that will only take you so far, and that it's really important to hold the larger backdrop. And all of the sort of constraining factors, and to really remember what sexual empowerment used to mean, which was that it was something collectively gained.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, I think what a lot of people who were kind of lured into that came out believing was that there was something wrong with them, or they were doing something wrong if they weren't having great sex, or their relationships didn't feel equitable or whatever.
Yep, that's exactly it. It's like, well, it must be me. I'm the problem. As opposed to like, I'm coming up against like, inequality that is much greater than my own individual experience.
So deeply entrenched that even if you do marry somebody who has like, in a hetero marriage, who like has, feminist ideals or whatever, like it's still part of like the air you breathe and the social expectations around you. And
Right. Well, and that's why I really wanted to underscore at the end of the book, like, I don't want this to be a sort of feminist Prince Charming narrative where it's like, oh, I found my feminist husband and like, isn't that great? And it's like, well, it is great. But it's also true that like, I'm not liberated. Like I'm not liberated just because I found one guy with whom I can have like a satisfying, fulfilling relationship. Right. Like, it's not like sexual freedom is not like feeling like you found shelter from the storm.
Yeah. I've also found like one of the things that I've thought so much about, like as I've grown up, I don't know the best way to say it, but is this like same idea that we were getting in the 90s of like, if you just make the right decisions, you can like have it all. And, and not taking into consideration that like, or not preparing particularly women who, for the reality that you actually have to make choices and that things get complicated, and that's not like a moral failing on your part, but it's that like being an adult with a lot of conflicting responsibilities is complicated and difficult.
Right. Like coming up against the lie of having it all. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Which is also like, I think, very intimately interwoven with this sort of like neoliberal empowerment, sexual liberation idea.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like the lean in sort of style of feminism, which like, I think there's been more of a sort of vocal critique, I think, lately around like that approach in the business realm, around like breaking the glass ceiling and leaning in.
Yeah.
But I think there's, we've been slower to sort of talk about that, like how it plays out in the sexual realm.
Yeah, and how women are blaming themselves for their lack of orgasms or for their shitty dates or whatever, without having a more sustained conversation about what sort of pressures like women are brought up under.
Right. And then it's all commercialized, right? Which brings us back to the sex advice industry, right? That like is focused on, tips and tricks, and is really all about selling this idea that if you like, go to the right workshop, or you like, read the right article, that you're going to be able to, be sexually empowered. So it's really the idea of commercializing sexual empowerment.
Yeah, right. Without any of the conversations about like how to build a sustaining like emotional connection, because that's not something that you can commodify in the same way.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I had this when I used to write my column. I had this my editor would usually let me write whatever I wanted, but sometimes would have things that she wanted me to write. And one time she was like, can you write an article on the best aphrodisiacs? And I was like, and I think I ended up writing something in the way that I do, which is like, you can't like eat the right food and expect that to make your relationship better. Like,
Right.
it's just not going to happen that way. Like,
Right.
here's what people said are aphrodisiacs. That might be tasty. Go ahead and eat that. But like, I think you need to deal with like the underlying problem, whatever that is.
I like that workaround, that creative workaround of like, sure, editor, I'll give you what you want, but not at all.
Yeah, I know you're not going to like it. I will write about aphrodisiacs. You won't like it.
Yeah, you're going to hate it. But
yeah, I mean, I try to do my job well, but sometimes like I have a different idea about like what is actually good.
Right. I mean, to me, that's doing your job well. Yeah, that's the definition of doing your job well, is like finding a way to sort of get away with that.
Right. Yeah. So where can people find your book?
People can find my book. They can go to my website, tracyclarkflury.com. There's a link on there. They can search for it on bookshop.org, Amazon. They can call their local bookseller and ask for them to carry it. Any of those.
Mm-hmm. Great. And where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Tracy Clark-Flory or at Jezebel.
Great. Thank you so much. It was really fun to talk to you about your book, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. This has been a really fun conversation.
Thank you for joining us for yet another episode of the Peep Show podcast. I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at PeachSage.
And I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at sapiotextual or at jessiesage.com.
We would like to remind you that we have a Patreon account and would appreciate your support. Please visit patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Our music is courtesy of Joe Kennedy. The show was produced by Jessie and PJ Sage.
Signing off. Have a great week.